Welcome to Ethanol Producer Magazine podcast. I am your host, Katie Schroeder with Ethanol Producer Magazine. In our podcast today, we are discussing the updates that the California Air Resources Board made to California's low carbon fuel standard. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Kari Buttenhoff, partner at Christianson PLLP. Thank you so much for joining us, Kari.
Yeah, thank you, Katie.
Absolutely. So just to get us started, could you talk our listeners through what amendments CARB made to the LCFS and which changes are relevant to the ethanol industry?
Yeah, so we had a pretty large amendment package go through this last year. And so there's a lot of big things that are happening. So one of the first of those and the main focus, I think, of that amendment was to adjust the compliance curve and also implement an acceleration mechanism for the compliance curve. So the compliance curve is how much carbon reductions we have to have each year in the program. And so there's been a lot of credit buildup so far, right? So we have a lot of excess credits that they weren't expecting. And so they have made adjustments to that compliance curve. Another major piece of that amendment is the new version of the GREET model. So we are moving from a GREET 3.0 to a GREET 4.0 model. So that is typically done. That's pretty standard for them to review that and to make adjustments and to do that every 2 or 3 years. And so what they're doing there is reviewing the emission factors and everything that are within the model to make sure that they have a more current data set that they're basing the CI scores on. Then we have another major addition, which is sustainability and traceability requirements. Mm-hmm. So they're aimed at strengthening some guardrails on crop-based fuels and really watching deforestation and land use changes, and then adding additional traceability in with that so that they can make sure that the land use is not getting out of hand. And then we have a few smaller adjustments that are in there, still very important. So there's an addition of a penalty and a true-up mechanism for fuel pathway CI scores. So if you exceed your certified CI score, there's now a penalty involved with that. If you do better than your certified CI score, you now get a true-up mechanism and you get those credits back in your account, which is great. There's a cap on biodiesel and renewable diesel crop-based feedstocks. That'll go into effect in 2028. And then also on the biodiesel front, the executive officer cannot accept any more biomass-based diesel applications once they hit certain ZEV goals, so electric vehicle goals out in California. And then a little more minor one, but kind of evening the playing field, is that they're also adding verification requirements for hydrogen and electricity pathways now. So they will now have to undergo verification just like all of our liquid fuels. So that's kind of an overview. There's a lot more in there that's much more minor, but those are the big key areas in this amendment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, what do we know about kind of the reasoning behind why these changes were made?
Yeah, so the GREET model, of course, I mentioned already that's kind of standard for them to update and move to a new version of the GREET model and update those emission factors or other things that have been troublesome inside those simplified calculators. The compliance curve and the acceleration mechanism, I think, is more market driven, right? So we've seen the prices falling on the LCFS credits and they have not been rebounding. And so I think this is their one to meet more, right? Their more advanced goals in their other rulings out in California. But secondary is also to address this market issue, right? And the surplus of credits that are in the system. As far as the sustainability and traceability requirements, they have a concern over land use change, right? Issues happening. Mm-hmm. And so they're putting some guardrails in place there. I still think personally, right, RFS has that kind of covered and they're monitoring it, and from people in industry, there's not a lot of concern with land use change, but we are seeing that more and more throughout different programs now.
Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining that. Could you explain how some of these new point of origin tracking requirements work? Like, what will that look like practically for an ethanol facility?
Yeah, so the sustainability requirements are going to be phased in, and we do have some initial ones right away here in 2025 or start of 2026. So the first main piece that they're implementing is the traceability. And so right now we are just focused on getting geographic shape files and coordinates of where the feedstocks are coming from. So there's no land use change requirements proving of when land was cultivated and things like that. It's first just focused on traceability. Then in 2028, we are going to move to more of a land use change monitoring. So you'll have to prove, now that you have the traceability, right, on all of your farmland, you'll have to prove that that farmland was managed prior to Jan 1 of 2008. So in 28, that requirement goes into play. And then the final piece is in 2031, where you'll have a full certification with chain of custody documentation. So it's the traceability, it's the land use change, and now it's also best environmental management practices. So you'll have to prove that you are keeping in mind biodiversity, that's you're enhancing soil fertility, that you're properly applying fertilizers, that you're reducing unsustainable water use. And so there's a lot of questions around what all that means still, and I think that'll get flushed out as we move towards 2031. But
Yeah.
for right now, 2026, we need to have attestation letters down our supply chain back to the farms, and we need to have geographical coordinates or shape files for where our feedstocks are coming from.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you for breaking that down. It's certainly like a lot of interesting and hopefully more clarity will come as we move closer and closer to 2031. I've also heard another factor come up among these changes, which is the rotating verification provider requirements. Could you explain what those are and what those look like? And also, like, when do those kind of come into the picture?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very, very time sensitive and relevant for right now. So we are coming up on our very first firm rotation. So that's how it is in the reg. It's a firm rotation on your verification body. So the easy part of the rule is essentially you can be with the same verifier for 6 years, and then you have to be off and away from them for a 3-year period before you can come back to that same provider, which sounds fairly simple and that it wouldn't be too bad to implement. However, when you look at the conflict of interest requirements that are wrapped in with that, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So the industry is pretty tight-knit, and there's
Yeah.
relatively small number of providers within the industry. So when you look at firm rotation paired with the conflict of interest, once you rotate away from a firm, they cannot become your consultant unless you're not going to go back to them as a verifier after 3 years. And when you choose your new verifier, there is a 5-year look back on that company that you're choosing to be your new verifier. So if they have done any kind of consulting or other work with you in the last 5 years, they cannot be your new verifier. So there, like I said, is a handful of us in the industry that are really familiar with these programs. However, we are used in different capacities as consultants and some as verifiers and things of that nature. So if you have not reserved at least 2 parties where you do nothing with them as verifiers, then you're going to have to start searching for new companies that are maybe not quite as experienced.
Oof. Yeah, that sounds really complex. I'm curious right now, in your opinion, how will these changes impact the reporting and verification process for ethanol producers involved in low carbon fuel standard markets, both in California and beyond, as other states on the West Coast are now kind of coming into the picture, and some of them have kind of indicated that they're wanting to kind of follow in California's footsteps moving forward. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the verifier rotation is going to play one piece in that, right? So depending upon which programs they're in and if they're compatible or if their pathways are significantly different, you might have a rotation in one program and not in the other. So that's going to start affecting each other, right? Another piece that affects various programs is that CARB has not opted to implement a less intensive verification yet at this point, where we would not have to complete site visits to plants every year, where Oregon, for example, has adopted that. And so we may qualify for a less intensive and no site visit in Oregon, but because they also participate in California, we can actually use that rule. So that piece is somewhere where they are not on the same page and causes some hiccups. As far as the sustainability stuff and everything, it's going to add, unfortunately, more audit burden, right? So we're going to have to be reviewing attestation letters on feedstocks. We're working with CARB to find out how far down the supply chain we have to go, if we have to go all the way back to origin, obtain the letters all the way through the supply chain, if we just have to do a couple steps, or what that may look like. So we're not yet sure on that part quite yet on what it's going to look like. The other big piece that we just heard about in the last week or so at some conferences that the agencies have been attending is that it sounds like Oregon and Washington and stuff are not looking to add the sustainability and traceability requirements, but rather to lean on California and their rules, since a lot of the pathways that are present in Oregon and Washington already have established California pathways. So it's sounding like we may not see that part carry over as well, which would be good. It's a little heavy on the sustainability stuff. So
yes, that is great news. That's exciting to hear. I'm curious, as new requirements for biomass-based feedstocks take effect in California's low-carbon fuel program, what areas of implementation might still be unclear or need more direction?
Yeah, so we've been asking some questions of CARB prior to actual implementation. They did just come out with some guidance, maybe about a week or two ago. There's a implementation guidance out there for some of the sustainability stuff. However, it was not as thorough as we had ever hoped that it would be. So it's missing a lot of pieces. So we are reaching back out again to see if they'll answer some stuff by email that was not covered in that implementation guidance. Some of those pieces that we're looking at are, if an ethanol plant ships like 40% of their fuel production out into the California market, does that mean that they only need to cover sustainability requirements on 40% or the equivalent feedstock of that fuel, right? So trying to figure that out. Does it need full coverage? Does it only need a partial coverage for what's going out there? And then also some questions around fiber, and if fiber is considered a crop-based fuel or not, and do they have to have sustainability, traceability requirements covered on that as well. The other piece, not necessarily an open question, but another piece that affects the ethanol plants that we didn't specifically cover at this point. Most of the ethanol plants create corn oil. So corn oil is not considered a crop-based feedstock, and so it does not have sustainability and traceability requirements, but it does have a new specified source feedstock attestation requirement. And so it is still under the traceability rules in that the biodiesel and renewable diesel producers are going to be coming back to the ethanol plants asking for attestation letters that says that this feedstock does consist of what is noted on this attestation, that we have not purposely created waste from it, that, it's got different pieces like that in the attestation letter. But you do have to have an attestation letter for every step in the supply chain that corn oil is touching. So if it goes through multiple marketers or brokers or things of that nature, there will be a letter required at each change of hands or each change of title.
Wow. That sounds like a lot of paperwork for sure.
Yes.
A lot to collect. Yeah. I guess kind of as like a final question, Kari, I'm curious, what are some words of wisdom you would give ethanol producers as they are kind of hearing some of these things, maybe feeling a little intimidated by some of these changes and what that might mean? What are a few closing thoughts you would give producers as to how to proceed wisely into this next year and this next verification cycle?
Yeah, it's definitely trying to stay caught up, and hopefully CARB gets the implementation guidance out first, right? And they're not always sure exactly what we're tackling. So I would say communication with them on the questions that are out there around these new rules and making sure that they're aware. There's a lot of times that I write into CARB from a verification perspective, and how is this going to get handled? What happens when we see this happen, right?
Yeah.
And they haven't even thought through some of those scenarios. And so they aren't even on their radar sometimes. And so just communicating with them and trying to understand, how is this going to work? What do we do when this happens?
Yeah.
so that they can start to plan that out so that we're not in the middle of a verification cycle or something trying to figure out consequences after the fact.
Yes.
So stay in
Yes.
contact with CARB. I know they don't always answer, but they are seeing the questions and trying to get implementation guidance out. Send questions to us as a verifier, right? And we gladly pass those through, just not on a specific plant perspective, but just trying
Right.
to get answers in general on how it'll work for verification. So we are welcome and open to being that source as well to try and get some questions through and out of CARB. We have to be careful around consulting, of course, from a verification standpoint, but happy to try and help
Yes.
get answers if we can. So
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share some insight with us into this complex world of understanding these new updates. And it's been great having you on the podcast. So thank you for joining us, Kari.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much to our listeners for joining us on Ethanol Producer Magazine podcast. Be sure to check out ethanolproducer.com for more industry insights and news on the ethanol industry.